Hi, my name is Rick Edgeman, and I'm Professor and Chair of the Management Department at Fort Hays State University. I also hold appointments at Aarhus University in Denmark, at Southern Denmark University, and in the Shingo Institute. So in this brief video, what I want to talk to you about is just a few simple and often used and very useful quality tools. They're useful in settings outside of quality applications as well. So one of the first things that we want to talk to you about would be process mapping, and there are many varieties of process mapping. You can see a few of those listed on this slide, so-called high-level process maps, top-down process flow maps, deployment flow charts, detailed process flow charts. So if we're talking about a high-level process map, it might look something like this, and it might proceed either from left to right or right to left, depending on how you want to interpret it. So most of you have heard of something called SIPOC, suppliers, inputs, processes, outputs, and customers. And that's more or less the way that business is conducted, which is to say that we obtain things from suppliers. Those become the inputs into our processes. Our processes transform those into the outputs that are then delivered to our customers, SIPOC. But if we have the opportunity, if we're initiating a business or if we're significantly redesigning or reinventing something, then we want to at least first consider that, not a SIPOC, but from the opposite direction, COPUS, which is to say we want to start with the end in mind. And by starting with the end in mind, that would mean to start with the customer. And starting with the customer says that we really need to obtain rigorously the voice of the customer to understand what it is they want, what it is they need, what their expectations are of us. Once we know what those are, that should help us determine the precise sort of outputs that we're capable of providing to those customers to satisfy those needs, wants, and expectations. Knowing what the outputs look like or need to look like, we can then configure our processes appropriately, which should tell us much more about the inputs we actually need, in order to eventually get to those outputs to satisfy the customers. And knowing what those inputs are should tell us much more about who are the sorts of suppliers that we need to work with to obtain those. Now, I said begin with the end in mind. And I said the customer in terms of beginning with the end in mind. There's a much more dramatic movement now toward what are called circular economies, and the idea is that we want to utterly and completely minimize waste if at all possible, which would mean that we want to move into an economy where that which exists at the end of the customer use of a product or service then becomes the fuel for some next product or service. So beginning with the end in mind really doesn't begin with the customer, it begins with the after use considerations. So bear that in mind as you go through this. Another sort of flowchart or process map would be a top-down flowchart. And usually that describes the what's. In other words, you'd list your primary process steps, so in order. You'd probably limit yourself to around 5 major steps in the process. And then beneath each one of those things, what you would do is, in the order of occurrence, list the major sub-processes, the major sub-steps, if you will, for each one of those things. Those are the big tasks that need to be completed now. So as you move from left to right on this particular flowchart or process map, you have the big ticket items, the A, B, C, D, E, the major steps. And then you see the sub-steps for each that are listed underneath those. Top-down. Still another would be called a deployment flowchart. Now, and that's about the what's and the who's. That is, we need to know what needs to be done and we need to determine who does that. So from a process perspective, the way that we would do that is that we'd list out those main process steps in the order that they occur, same as we did on the last one. Across the top of whatever surface you're using to write on or to construct your process map, list the names of the people or organizations involved in the process. And if you're not listing the names of the people, as in Sam Jones, then what you want to list instead would be something like the position, Vice President of Operations, or whatever Sam Jones' position is. And that's actually useful in the event that that person ends up leaving the organization or is transferred or duties or changed or something of that sort. So I actually advocate not for who by name as much as who by position. So do that. Beneath those names or positions, draw a box, list the step in that box. If any of the entities assist or advise those with primary responsibility, then list their name too, with some sort of an oval around it. So what you're really looking for is not just the person with primary responsibility, but additionally their backups. Okay. Remember, things happen. People become ill, people leave, people are injured, whatever the case may be. And so you usually need to have some sort of a backup plan in place, which means you need to know who the primary individual is, but also a secondary individual, and maybe more than one. So we would want to do that. And then repeat that process with the second and subsequent steps. And in this way, you end up with the what's and. So it might look something like that. Okay. And then lastly, a detailed flowchart. For some of you who might be old enough to have done some serious computer programming, then this would look fairly familiar. And usually what I would say is you start at the top. Where does the process start? And at the bottom you have where does it end? Or on the left, where does it start? And on the right, where does it end? It doesn't matter whether you're going left to right or top to bottom. But in between, you list all the major steps and what can be done. So out of each one of those steps, there's usually something that has to happen. Either you arrive at some sort of a yes or no decision, either proceed or move to the left, move to the right, whatever the case may be, or you move on directly through to the next step. Now, what I always advocate is having two of these charts. The first one is the process as it currently exists, and then a second one would be the ideal representation. Because between what currently exists and the ideal representation, ordinarily speaking, what you would be able to identify are some low-hanging fruit opportunities for improvement. So look for that. And I should also note that even to quote-unquote experts, similar experience, similar knowledge, flowcharting the same process would probably end up with a different chart, a different map, because most processes are sufficiently complex as to make that the case. Next, this is an often used tool. It goes by two different names, or actually more than that. It's often called the Deming wheel, named after W. Edwards Deming, who popularized its use. He didn't originate it. He's not the developer. The developer was his mentor, a man named Walter A. Shewhart. But still, it's often known as the Deming wheel or Deming cycle. It is just as commonly known as the Plan, Do, Check, Act cycle, PDCA. Now, later in his life, Deming changed the word from check to study. And the reason that he changed the word from check to study is he wanted to communicate the seriousness of that step, that it isn't just a quick and dirty look at something, that it is a true study of results. So the way that this works, and let me give you a modified version. It's a modified version that works better, but it also represents the way that this is practiced in many organizations. First, it is very much like preparing to take a trip. When you prepare to take a trip or take a vacation, you usually need to know where it is you're starting out from. And that's what's represented across the very top of this graph, where it says assess baseline conditions and performance. You need to know where you're at before you decide where you're going to go and how you're going to get there. So assess baseline conditions and performance. Once you do that, plan. Plan to make a change that you believe will benefit the performance of the process. From plan, we move on to do, which means to begin to execute that plan. So we would implement the change that whatever the plan suggests we should do is. Implement your change, I would say preferably on a small scale or on a pilot scale. And the reason that I say that is because just because you think something is going to improve results doesn't mean that that actually happens. So implement preferably on a small scale. It may not improve things enough. It may not improve things at all for that matter. So you need to be able to know whether or not a large-scale investment is going to be justified before you just wholesale implement something. Assess baseline conditions, plan a change, execute the change or do. Study the results of the change. This is an analysis, and this is a very serious step. We want to be able to know whether or not the change that we introduced in the do phase led to the sorts of results that we need to have in order to justify rolling out that execution on a larger scale, on a whole process scale, let's say. So plan the change, do the change, study the results of the change, and then standardize your process before you roll it out more extensively. Now, there's a reason that you want to do that. There are multiple reasons you want to do that. One of the reasons that you want to do that is because if you do not standardize, you will have this thing not as one new process, but as manifesting in many different forms, a different form everywhere it goes, more or less, just because there'll be small differences if you don't first standardize. Now, when we say standardize, what we really mean is that we're trying to get to the best process or best practice currently available. Okay. So we want to standardize, and that makes our solution a more portable solution. Assess baseline conditions, plan a change in the process that you think will benefit its performance, execute or do the change, study the results of the change, standardize the process before you roll it out more extensively, and then act, which ordinarily speaking will represent rolling that out on a larger scale. So we'll want to act, roll it out on a larger scale. It could mean return to status quo. If your improvements, let's say, resulting from the change that you made were not sufficient, if they weren't enough, or if in fact you were just completely wrong, and rather than benefiting the process, it led to some sort of decline in the performance. Okay. And then you see between act and plan, hold the gain. Now the idea about this, remember we called it Deming cycle. Okay. Deming cycle, plan, do, check, act cycle. PDSA is what I usually call it, plan, do, study, act cycle. Okay. Hold the gain. Key word in there, cycle, meaning that this is a cycle of continuous improvement. We continue to use this on processes. Okay. It isn't just a one-time change and then you never try to work on the process for improvement again. It is a cycle of continuous improvement. But as we cycle through and make improvement after improvement after improvement, the idea is not to let it slip back, to hold whatever gains that you've been able to establish. So this is really a modified plan, do, study, act cycle. So another tool would be Pareto analysis. So Alfredo Pareto was an economist of about 150 years ago, and what he studied was the distribution of wealth in nations. And what he found was what is now a well-known result, the idea that the vast amount of the wealth in a population lies in the hands of a relatively few individuals. Now, as of 15 or 20 years ago, it was something like this, that roughly the 200 wealthiest people in the world, that their wealth matched that of the 2 billion poorest. That has actually become a trend that's more pronounced now than it was even then. So now they estimate that the combined wealth of only the 8 wealthiest people in the world matches that of the 3 billion poorest in the world. Of the 40% of the population of the globe that is poorest is matched by only 8 people. Roughly 1 out of every billion people on the planet matches the wealth of about 400 million people. That's what you'd have when you compare the 8 wealthiest to the 3 billion poorest. 1 person in exchange for 400 million. 1 person in exchange for more than the population of the United States. So what happened, however, is that if you think about that sort of general idea, or that idea was generalized. It was generalized by Joseph M. Juran, one of the gurus or fathers of modern quality management. And so what Juran noticed was this idea that you might say, well, look, if you're looking at a process, there are lots of things that could go wrong with a process or a product or a service. But generally speaking, only a few of those things that could go wrong lead to problems most of the time. So if you're going to improve a process, one of the things that you could do is you could look at it and say, okay, what are the things that make things go bad most commonly? The most common sources of things going bad, or most common causes of things going bad, or going in the wrong directions. Because then what you'll do is you will focus your resources, focus your time, focus your energy on reducing the impact of those few causes from among many possible ones. So what we're trying to do with Pareto analysis is separate out, and you'll hear me use this phrase often throughout the course. We want to be able to separate the vital few causes of things going wrong from the trivial many causes of things going wrong. And we'll want to focus our attention on those vital few that have the greatest impact. So that's what we're looking for, and usually we would organize that into a graph that looks more or less like this. This is an example where maybe we're just looking at photocopier use and saying, okay, we have more photocopier use than we should have. That costs us money, especially over a large organization. The question is why? And so what we're seeing here is that, oh, there are a lot of reasons why. One of which is policy is unclear on personal usage. So maybe people are writing holiday letters and they're using the company copier to make copies of their holiday letters to send out to friends or something like that. Okay, policy unclear. Or making more copies than are needed. Or, well, we didn't copy pages that should have been in there, and now rather than just unstaple and so on, we'll just make all new copies of handouts. Or. Lots and lots of reasons. The one that occurs most frequently would be sitting to the left, the second most frequent beside that, the third most frequent beside that, and so on. And then notice that the bars are dropping in height from left to right as you proceed across the graph until you get to that last bar. And that's because that last bar is a catch-all, quote-unquote, other category, everything else. So where are you going to devote your energy, your resources? You're going to devote those in those vital few areas that lead to the problems most commonly. So that would be in the case of this example, policy unclear on personal usage, maybe more copies than needed. And you'd want to then dig deeper into those and see what can be done. Now, I will say that there are multiple ways we can determine the height of these bars. The most common one is just by count. How often does this problem occur? But probably a better way to do it, if at all possible, is to monetize. Instead of saying how often does it occur, more like how much does it cost us? How much does this source of problem cost us? And then instead of focusing on the most frequently occurring causes, you would be focusing on the most costly causes. But of course, they're related ideas. Still another tool goes by many names, the cause and effect diagram, or Fishbone diagram, or Ishikawa diagram. If you hear it called the Ishikawa diagram, it's after the man who developed it, Karu Ishikawa, a late quality engineer from Japan. The idea is this, that to the extreme right of this graph, out at the head of the fish, if you will, you see an effect. Okay. Ordinarily speaking, the effect represents one of two things. Either it's a problem that you want to be able to diminish the impact of that problem, or eliminate it if possible, or it represents an opportunity that you would like to be able to exploit or leverage. What all of the rest of those things on the graph represent, and you see 6 main feeders into the effect: materials, environment, methods, man or mind power, machinery, measurement. Those are the so-called old categories. The old categories actually were all the 4 M's: materials, methods, manpower, and machinery. At least that's what it was called. So the man or mind power, well, that's the human ecology of the organization. Material is probably clear enough. Methods, how you're doing things. Measurement, is an addition to the original 4Ms. So that when you see measurement on there, here's the idea. We need to be able to measure things. Otherwise, how do we actually know whether we're improving or if we're actually suffering worse performance? And the environment, when you see the environment on there, that could be many things. That could be the natural environment and the impact on the natural environment. It could be natural environmental factors. It could be that you're operating in a clean room environment in a manufacturing setting. And it could be the temperature and dust control and so on inside that clean room area. It could be the political climate of the organization. But these are just generic categories, and the idea is that everything that you see on there except the effect represent potential causes of the effect, some of which are probably very real, some of which probably only occur very, very rarely or maybe never. So this is not really a standalone tool. It's a tool that's meant to be used in conjunction with others. It's a tool that is meant to identify potential causes of a problem. And then you might have something like the Pareto diagram that we just looked at. Look at a few of those much more carefully. So it's that process of moving from one tool to the next tool to the next tool and progressively trying to work our way toward a solution. Now, there are some hints or helpful guidelines I would give you on constructing one of these. One of which is that with the effect, it is normally possible to state this in the positive. So what do I mean by that? Let's suppose that you're a time-definite delivery service like UPS or FedEx or Flying Tiger or DHL or one of those. And the problem that you're encountering, notice the language I use, the problem, is that you have too many late deliveries. Well, rather than state the effect out there as reduce late deliveries, what I might do is I might state that in a different way. Increase on-time deliveries. Okay. Now, you may just say, well, you just picked whatever side of the coin you wanted, but there's a reason that I did that. And the reason that I did that fundamentally is human nature and the idea that people don't like to point fingers at themselves. And if it turns out that they're part of the problem, people will oftentimes do anything except point the finger at themselves. So what happens is that when you can phrase this in the positive, most of the time you get more and better suggestions as to what those potential causes might be. And that is something I've seen work out in practice many, many times at many organizations that I've worked with. Next, something that I would recommend is all 6 of those main feeders that you see there, or whatever categories you use to feed into your cause and effect diagram, I would have on there twice, once on top, once on bottom. Once on top where I would have basically enablers, the thing that enable you to either eliminate the problem or to leverage the opportunity, the effect. And on bottom I would have the obstacle side of those same categories. Something else that's a useful hint is a lot of times when you're doing this, it's a multiple department problem or issue that you're working on. So what I might do is, as the team, not usually individual, as the team that constructs the cause and effect diagram, once I think I've got a good one formed, I might take it on a big piece of butcher paper and post it up in some department that either affects it or is affected by the issue under consideration. And just post it up on a wall and leave a red marker there. And come back in a few days and see what annotations have been made, what notes have been made. And then I'd move it to another department. And in the other department, maybe I'd leave a blue marker or a green marker or something like that. And I'd come back in a few days and there'd be blue or green markings on it. And I would cycle that through the departments that were either affected by this or affect the issue. And then at the end of a relatively short period of time, what I have is the best thinking of the team that put this together, and then the thinking of the people who are really close to the issue. And I would know where those ideas came from, maybe not who they came from, but I would know, oh, these came from manufacturing, oh, this came from finance, oh, this came from accounting, oh, this came from product design. So that helps you to get a more complete picture of what's going on. And then you would revise your cause and effect diagram. Now, over the next few slides, there's just a couple of. So for example, on this slide, it says, hey, here's a manufacturing example. And what you see here is 8 suggested categories when you're using a fishbone or cause and effect diagram for manufacturing applications. Management, which would be the money power, measurement, materials, equipment or machinery, technology, maintenance, the environment that we talked about. On bottom, it's listed here as milieu or Mother Nature. The human contribution, the human ecology of the organization, which is listed there as manpower, and the methods or the process that you're using. And then out at the end, you see the manufacturing problem or opportunity. Similarly, we can come up with a relatively generic service cause and effect diagram, and the sorts of categories that you might see for service would be the ones represented in red across the top and across the bottom. Physical evidence, people, place, service, productivity and quality, process, promotion, and price. And lastly, you see a more specific example, not very detailed, which is working on a problem of shorted out motor coils and the exploration of causes for that. And then we would have something like a familiar tool that's used in many different areas, a so-called SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Now, I like to construct that in a particular way. And the way that I construct it usually looks something like this. You probably see the NEWS and say, oh man, that guy is directionally challenged, and in truth, I am directionally challenged. That's a fact, but not in this case. Okay, so in some sense, I am using NEWS as northeast, west, south, in some sense, to convey direction. But I have them in the order here of NEWS because of something that we want out of not just a SWOT analysis, but pretty much anything that we do, any of the tools that we use. We want news. We want to learn something. We want to become more informed by virtue of the analysis that we're conducting than we were before. So we want to know where we are, and we want to know how to get to the next place. And that's what this should help us obtain. So I would only note, since there's a very good chance you've all seen SWOT analysis before, that the internal assessment of the enterprise is represented by strengths and weaknesses. Those are the things that are internally controllable to the organization. But then there are the external or environmental factors, and those are the things that are outside the direct control of the organization, although maybe the organization can influence those to an extent. And those are the opportunities and threats. And then we have the positives, those are strengths and opportunities. The negatives, those are weaknesses and threats. And so what I have in each of the boxes that you see there, S, W, T, and O, is I have representative sorts of questions that you would normally be asking when you're conducting a SWOT analysis. So these are just a few of the standard tools that you might see used in quality applications. And those standard tools that we looked at included something like process maps, Pareto diagrams, cause and effect diagrams, the plan, do, study, act cycle, and finally SWOT analysis. There will be many more tools that we take a look at on occasion, and this is just a start for you. Thank you.